Hello, welcome back. We're in Leviticus chapter 23. And if you're familiar with this chapter or some other things, then you're probably aware that this is the chapter that really kind of broke everything off uh, for a certain pastor that I know. He wanted to do a series on this chapter, which I was thrilled about because I love this chapter. It's one of the best chapters in Leviticus. It's about all the biblical feasts. The problem was he couldn't quite figure out a way to spin it to not matter anymore, but then still matter. And I'll kind of show you some of that. But a lot of it is just, uh, it's kind of like opening a box and you see there's some stuff in it you need to learn about. But rather than do that, you just close the box again because the biblical feasts seem complicated and hard. And I'll say up front, this has nothing to do with your salvation. It has nothing to do with uh, going to heaven or hell. This is something God set in place to have moments throughout the year where we reflected on the things that He had done for us. Now, He did give it to the Hebrews, but there's nothing in the Bible that says we can't celebrate these feasts. There's nothing in the Bible that says you have to necessarily, but we can learn from them in the patterns, and the significance of each one of these matters even to us who now live as new believers, as born again believers, and have been grafted into these covenants. So let's jump into Leviticus chapter 23, and we'll see all the cool stuff that's in here. It'll be a little hard to understand at times, but I promise if you stick with me, I think we'll get a pretty good grasp on what it really means. I'm going to read from the Complete Jewish Bible, mostly because I think that, well, maybe not. We'll read from the New Living Translation. That way, if you think, well, he's making all this about the Jewish people, we'll read it and then I'll explain it a little bit. The translations aren't huge, other than remember it says, the Lord said to Moses instead of Adonai said to Moses. Now, the translation can be, but this was done in a way to make it more about Jesus and less about God. So we talked about that a few times. I'll let you go look at the other videos about that one. So Leviticus chapter 23. The Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, which you are to proclaim as official days for holy assembly. And I know this is going to take a while, but notice in the Bible, God never said that we are to gather on Sunday morning in public or congregational worship. But He did say these are for holy assembly. And we ignore those. So we'll have to dig into that a little bit more, and I promise we will. It says, you have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of complete rest, an official day for holy assembly. It is the Lord's Sabbath day, and it must be observed wherever you live. In addition to the Sabbath, these are the Lord's appointed festivals, the official days for holy assembly that are to be celebrated at their proper times each year. The Lord's Passover begins at sundown on the 14th day of the first month. On the next day, the 15th day of the month, you must begin celebrating the festival of unleavened bread. Now, keep in mind, God's telling you you can't work, you have to celebrate. And we said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to work. I know. This festival to the Lord continues for 7 days, and during that time, the bread you eat must be made without yeast. On the first day of the festival, all the people must stop their ordinary work and observe an official day for holy assembly. For 7 days, you must present special gifts to the Lord. On the seventh day, the people must again stop all their ordinary work to observe an official day for holy assembly. So if you really want to know why we gave all these up, is because if you gave people all these times off, a whole week to just kind of celebrate a number of times throughout the year, how much money are we going to lose? That's where the love of money really becomes a good principle to understand. The reason we don't do these are not because we don't want to take 7 days off, but because we think we can't afford it. What about the economy? What about money? I think that's a problem. But Then the Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you enter the land I am giving you and you harvest its first crops, bring the priest a bundle of grain from the first cutting of your grain offering, or your grain harvest. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest will lift it up before the Lord so that it will be accepted on your behalf. On that same day, you must sacrifice a 1-year-old male lamb with no defects as a burnt offering to the Lord. With it, you must present a grain offering consisting of 4 quarts of choice flour moistened with olive oil. It will be a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. You must also offer 1 quart of wine as a liquid offering. You do not eat any bread or roasted grain or fresh kernels on that day until you bring this offering to your God. This is a permanent law for you, and it must be observed from generation to generation wherever you live. From the day after the Sabbath, the day you bring the bundle of grain to be lifted up as a special offering, count off 7 full weeks. Keep counting until the day after the 7th Sabbath, 50 days later, then present an offering of new grain to the Lord. From wherever you live, bring 2 loaves of bread to be lifted up before the Lord as a special offering. Make these loaves from 4 quarts of choice flour and bake them with yeast. They will be an offering to the Lord from the first of your crops. Along with the bread, present 7 1-year-old male lambs with no defects, 1 young bull, and 2 rams as a burnt offering to the Lord. These burnt offerings, together with the grain offering and liquid offering, will be a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Then you must offer 1 male goat as a sin offering and 2 1-year-old male lambs as a peace offering. The priest will lift up the 2 lambs as a special offering to the Lord, together with the loaves representing the first of your crops. These offerings, which are holy to the Lord, belong to the priest. That same day will be proclaimed an official day for Holy Assembly, a day in which you do no ordinary work. This is a permanent law for you, and it must be observed from generation to generation wherever you live. When you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along with the edges of your field. Do not pick up what the harvesters drop. Leave it for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God. The Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. On the first day of the appointed month in early autumn, you are to observe a day of complete rest. It will be an official day for Holy Assembly, a day commemorated with loud blast of a trumpet. You must do no ordinary work on that day. Instead, you are to present special gifts to the Lord." Isn't it funny that we refuse to rest the way God told us to rest? What is the reasoning behind that? Money. So then the Lord said to Moses, "Be careful to celebrate the Day of Atonement on the 10th day of the same month, 9 days after the Festival of Trumpets. You must observe it as an official day for Holy Assembly, a day to deny yourselves and present special gifts to the Lord. Do no work during that entire day because it is the Day of Atonement, when offerings of purifications are made for you, making you right with God, the Lord your God. All who do not deny themselves that day will be cut off from God's people, and I will destroy anyone among you who does any work on that day. You must not do any work at all. This is a permanent law for you, and it must be observed from generation to generation wherever you live. This will be a Sabbath day of complete rest for you, and on that day you must deny yourselves. This day of rest will begin at sundown on the 9th day of the month and extend until sundown on the 10th day. And the Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. Begin celebrating the festival of shelters on the 15th day of the appointed month, 5 days after the Day of Atonement. This festival to the Lord will last 7 days. On the first day of the festival, you must proclaim an official day for Holy Assembly when you do no ordinary work. For 7 days you must present special gifts to the Lord. The 8th day is another holy day on which you present your special gifts to the Lord. This will be a solemn occasion with no ordinary work may be done that day. These are the Lord's appointed festivals. Celebrate them each year as official days of Holy Assembly by presenting special gifts to the Lord, burnt offerings, grain offerings, sacrifices, and liquid offerings, each on its proper day. These festivals must be observed in addition to the Lord's regular Sabbath days, and the offerings are in addition to your personal gifts. the offerings you give to fulfill your vows, and the voluntary offerings you present to the Lord. Remember that this 7-day festival to the Lord, the Festival of Shelters, begins on the 15th day of the appointed month, after you have harvested all the produce of your land. The first day of the 8th day of the festival will be days of complete rest. On the first day, gather branches from magnificent trees, palm fronds, boughs from leafy trees, and willows that grow by the streams. Then celebrate with joy before the Lord your God for 7 days. You must observe this festival to the Lord for 7 days every year. This is a permanent law for you, and it must be observed on the appointed month from generation to generation. For 7 days you must live outside in little shelters. All native-born Israelites must live in shelters. This will remind each new generation of Israelites that I made their ancestors live in shelters when I rescued them from the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So Moses gave the Israelites these instructions regarding the annual festivals of the Lord. So a few things are happening here. God is telling us to rest, to stop working for Him. And He's also telling us in certain senses to remember the past, to remember where we came from. And we talk sometimes that everyone should remember the past, not repeat it. And we don't even remember it anymore. We don't observe the past. But God built this system in to help us do that. And we, for the most part, just ignore it. So these are the 7 biblical feasts. The 10 Commandments were the first 10 of 613 laws of Torah. There's no law that does not conform to the principles of the 10 Commandments. So these passages are presented from a priestly point of view. So sacred indicates something that has been set apart as special. These are sacred biblical feasts. They've been set apart by God for our benefit. So almost every story we have of Jesus is Him in Jerusalem attending one of these feasts. That was a required, 3 of them are a required pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And so almost every time we see Him there, that's what He was there for. So the first fixed time is the Sabbath. The Sabbath was established in Genesis chapter 2, and God reinforced the duty of Israel to observe the Sabbath. So if you think in terms of a king or even a pagan god or any ruler saying, you have to not work, why would we not take that seriously? He literally says, do not work, and we don't want to listen to him. If your boss says, hey, go home, don't do any work today, you're probably going to listen to him and just go home. But for some reason, we argue with God about that. So in Exodus 20, chapter 20, verse 8, it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The key word is remember. The Hebrew is kazar, and it means to recall, to bring something back to the original meaning. The Hebrew for Sabbath is Shabbat. There are many types of Sabbath, Shabbats, and they have different meanings and places in the religious calendar. Some of them are preparation Shabbats. Don't do any ordinary work, only prepare for the festival. And then the day after, take it all down, put it all back where it needs to go. God worked all of that into His schedule for us, for our benefit. So verse 3 is the 7th day Sabbath. This type of Sabbath contains 3 elements that separate it from all other days of the week. The 7th day Shabbat prohibits work, in Hebrew, melekahah. And second, it is a sacred day and is to be treated as such. And third, it must be observed by all Israelites, no matter where they may be. So verse 3 says complete rest. In Hebrew, the words used are Shabbat, Shabbaton, the most restful cessation of assigned task. In other words, of the holy observances that require resting, the 7th day Shabbat is to be the one where absolutely no work is to be done. And I've said this before, if you really enjoy hunting or fishing, and this is kind of something you enjoy, you could do it on Shabbat. It's not do any usual work, not work that you have to do, but stuff you want to do. So manna, a double portion, was to be gathered on the sixth day of the week so that it didn't have to be gathered on the seventh day, the Shabbat. There's even a case in Numbers where God ordered a man executed because he was gathering sticks on Shabbat, presumably to build a fire. That's our theory. We'll get to that when we get to Numbers. And there are also Sabbath years every seventh year. We'll get into some of that too. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first day is the Shabbat, and also the last day is. So you got a day to set up and a day to take down. God put it all in there for us for our benefit. There is a distinction between the Sabbath and a Sabbath. The Sabbath is referring to the original seventh day, Shabbat. A Sabbath is any other ordained day of rest. So the seventh day Shabbat is above all these other days. And the name for the seventh day is Shabbat. All other days of the week are referred to by a number. Like, we have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. In Hebrew, the Sabbath is the only one with a name. The rest are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I think that's pretty cool. A Sabbath on the first day of the biblical feast was for preparation, and women could prepare food and men could gather the wood for fires. And so the seventh day Sabbath was for physical and spiritual rest. It was, you just relax. It's a day off. So the words, it shall be a Sabbath to Adonai, are important. That makes the Sabbath holy property. And we've discussed the penalty for trespassing against holy property. Hebrews understood that the Sabbath belonged to God. In Luke 6:5 it says, and he was saying to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. All those Jews that heard Jesus say that knew what he was saying. He was the owner, the Lord of the Sabbath. So the Sabbath was Christ's holy property. It was his domain. He couldn't have said that he was God in a more forceful or clear way to the people listening. So biblical festivals interrupted Israelites' daily lives. 3 of these festivals required them to be at the temple no matter where they were on the planet, which most of them weren't very far from it, but some were like 1,000 miles away. So it would take like a month to get there. So preparation would have to begin a little bit sooner and several days journey sometimes just to get there. So there was a certain amount of danger in every journey too, and the cost was greater. Like I've said before, sometimes we won't go to church just because it's too hot or too cold or too windy or too sunny or too whatever it is outside. In verse 5, we get the dates and the requirements for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. There are two main calendars, the civil calendar and then the religious calendar. We have a fiscal calendar and a civil calendar, a school calendar, a football schedule. We have all these different kinds of calendars too. But the Hebrew religious calendar makes Nisan the first month. The Hebrew civil calendar makes Tishri the first month. So the Jewish New Year is a civil calendar event, not a religious calendar event. So it occurs on the first day of Tishri, the first day of the new civil calendar, a new civil year. Now, just to confuse you even more, during this era, the months did not have names either. They were numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It was not until the Jews exiled to Babylon that the Hebrews gave names to the month, and they adopted the Babylonian names. So, do you need to memorize all of this? No. What we need to see in this, in the patterns and the principles he's teaching, is God expects us to rest, and he expects us to spend time together and focused on him, not just working 365 days a year, not in trying to build ourselves up, and not saying, hey, next year I'm going to pay more attention to God, but this year I got to work. He didn't say any of that. He wants us to stop and remember who he is. So the Torah will call Nisan the first month and usually Tishri the seventh month. So before it's dark, the Passover lamb is to be slaughtered. A Hebrew day starts at sundown. Remember that. So Passover is a one-day event celebrated in the afternoon and evening, a one-day biblical feast on the 14th of Nisan. So the Hebrews were taught to slaughter the lamb and paint its blood on the doorpost in Exodus. We saw that. So Passover is not connected to a certain day of the week. The 14th of Nisan will change from year to year. It's not always on like a Wednesday or Sunday or something like that. Easter moves around because it's the first Sunday after Passover. It's on a specific day on a Sunday. So the day following Passover is the first day of another biblical feast, the Feast of Unleavened Bread or Matzah. The first day of unleavened bread is Nisan 15. That's when it starts. So literally, verse 6 says the pilgrimage feast of unleavened bread. The Hebrew word that is typically not translated as pilgrimage is Hag, H-A-G. So this is important because three of the biblical feasts are unique. Any festival that is a Hag, a pilgrimage festival, cannot be celebrated at home. It's required to be at the Jerusalem temple. So we can't have that festival at my house. It has to be there. Even if the temple's not there, you can't obviously do it because you can't pilgrimage to it. So because Passover is the kickoff of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the two are treated like one festival for the pilgrimage because it's just too much work to go and come back and go and come back. So the day after Passover, the 15th of Nisan, and the first day of unleavened bread is also a Sabbath. Not the Sabbath, but a Sabbath. A day of ceasing from normal work so the special work of preparation could be done. The required pilgrimage for the Feast of Matzah usually had to begin before Passover to arrive in Jerusalem at the time, because remember, you couldn't travel during this time. You had to get there before all of this stuff started. So what was the prophetic meaning attached to Passover and unleavened bread? Remember, I'm not expecting you to understand all of this or memorize it. We're looking for the patterns and the principles. So Passover had been celebrated for 1,300 years before Christ even came. Pentecost was not a new holiday. It was not a new holiday created when the Holy Spirit came. Pentecost, called Shavuot in Hebrew, was established right here on Mount Sinai. The Holy Spirit simply came on that day, and then Christians decided to call it Pentecost for the Greek, which is 50 days past. We covered all of that in a previous video, but each had a physical component. The sacrifices and the ceremonies and the feasting or the fasting. Each had a spiritual component, a higher meaning that was not revealed until Yeshua had came, and sometimes even later. This is why knowing the Old Testament matters. Passover commemorates an event that actually happened. This was a historic event. So, and Pesach in Hebrew is Passover. It also looked forward prophetically, spiritually, to a day when that lamb that God brought would provide and paint his own blood on the doorpost of each person's house or each person's body, our dwelling place, so that eternal death would pass over us. And all those who trusted in Yeshua as the lamb, we will never die. We'll have a physical death, but not a spiritual death. So on Pesach, Nisan 14, about 30 AD, the highest meaning of Passover occurred. The Passover lamb, once and for all, was slaughtered for all mankind, those who accepted it. So no one was forced to paint the blood on their doorpost, and no one's forced to accept Messiah. The Passover is one feast that has been both physically and spiritually fulfilled. The Passover is a day of remembrance. It is a finished work. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread is all about sin and decay. Anything that causes fermentation has to be removed from every Israelite's home. So remember, we're looking for patterns and principles. Take everything out of your home that has any sin or maybe doesn't honor God in some way. Get that stuff out. So fermentation is the process of decay. And the Bible makes a parallel between leavening and sin. It's a loose parallel. I don't think it necessarily means sin, but sin is the agent in man and in the world that results in death and decay. Remember, we weren't meant to die, but then sin came into the world and decay started. So the more leavening that is added, the faster and the more violent the fermentation process. The more sin that is in us, the faster and more violent our decay, our spiritually and physically dying, our decay. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread, matzah, was a remembrance of Israel leaving Egypt. The leaven, the sin was all left behind. So leave all that, come be a redeemed people. That's the way we are when we accept Yeshua. We leave all of that behind and start living in a different way. So no decay, no sin was to come with Israel in the new life in the new land. They were redeemed, saved. Redeemed means a price had to be paid for their freedom. So notice the order. First, Israel had to accept the atoning blood of the Pesach lamb, the Passover lamb. Then the sin was removed from their life. Now they were redeemed, and it is the same for us. All of that was an act of grace by God. We didn't earn any of it. Now, Yeshua went to the grave, but because he was the ultimate unleavened bread, he had no sin in him. So his body did not decay. So Jesus is the bread of life. He is the matzah of life, the unleavened, sinless, never decaying bread of life. He went to the cross and died. That is the Passover. Then he went into that tomb, did not decay, entered into a new life. That is the unleavened bread. And just as Yeshua died on Passover Day, he entered the tomb during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The events in Egypt happened on a physical level. On a spiritual level, when Jesus was in that tomb, his sinless body refused to decay and he arose. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was fulfilled. He is now the never decaying, sinless bread of life. The Feast of Matzah is also a remembrance. It is both physically and spiritually completed. We don't have to worry about trying to do it. It's just a remembrance of something that's already happened. So you don't need to memorize all of these festivals. Just look at the principles and what Jesus fulfilled by being these things. Because remember, what God's showing them is what's coming. He wants them to see these things so when Jesus fulfilled it, they would recognize it. Sadly, most did not, but some did, and they brought the word to us. So let's spread it to other people. Share, like this, tell other people about it, and let's just get the word of God out. God bless. Love God, love people, and change the world.